Hello everybody, John Parker here, Technical Director at the Arboricultural Association. Welcome back to Stonehouse for another edition of Tree of the Best. We've got three great presentations here, all from the 2019 Amenity Conference in Exeter, and all today on the theme of pruning. Three great speakers. We've got Ted Green, we've got Tony Kirkham, and we've got Reg Harris. All three great speakers for you on this one theme. And first of all, to kick things off, is Ted Green with his keynote talk from 2019, asking what is pruning?
While you can hear me. While we're doing that, I was excited to think that they were going to have a program which included pruning. And the first thing I thought was, you know, as a layman, what is pruning? And I first went straight away to Philip Wilson's book on the alphabet, or whatever it is, of tree terms. And if you haven't got it, you should have it, because a lot of you don't know much about trees. So really get out Philip Wilson's book. So there you go. There it is. What's pruning? And if you think about it, if pruning includes just the cutting of trees, then it really does open some doors, because of all the things that happen, from bacteria, nematodes, insects, lots of root herbivores, right up to the animals that eat them, and all the rest of it, and of course him. Not a laugh. I worked hours on that. There's a lot of buggers here, must be mowing grass. God, dear, oh dear. Poor devils. So there you go, because cutting grass is basically shearing something off, isn't it? The same as what you do. And of course, when you look at it, I mean, look at this. This seriously is filling in time between being born and dying. Yeah? Go and see your GP. You're only here for 70 years, active. And then there's that one. I mean, look at that. Imagine starving a poor tree. Beautiful, beautiful object. We're all against starving trees, but their whole ethos is starving trees and mutilating them. They're very quiet. Dear, oh dear. And that one, I mean, that's employment. That gives some of you work to do, doesn't it? Cutting hedges. But the interesting thing about that is that when we really did start, and it's ancient trees, not veteran trees, when we really did start, people at Burnham Beeches were looking at cutting the old beech trees, and Mark Frater said, we really do get much better results with the beech trees, which are what we call whiskery, you know, lots of epicormic growth on them. They really worked, and I just wonder whether the old boys in the past realised that. But certainly the nurserymen did, because that's what they sell, is whiskery beech for the hedge. And the French idea. No, what an audience. God, dear, oh dear. I wasted hours, I burned a candle on this talk, and you can't even get a laugh out of them. But that's the French. I love it. Lots of land maggots eating the hedge. But then again, when we're going to think about how these animals and all the rest of it actually cut the branches, this is to my dear old friend the beaver, and beavers actually much prefer to coppice. This idea that they keep felling big trees. They only need big trees to make their lodges. Basically, they love coppicing. And there's my other friend, a root pruner. Spends his life chomping away on things. They're crushed. So you've got the one that's cutting, you've got one that's crushing. You've got another one with teeth, so that's sort of cutting the branches. There, my old friends. Browsing, which, I mean, that could be any one of several animals doing that. That one, you know, that's deer. It's going to work, and everybody knows about the response to browsing by holly, so I won't waste time on that. They only gave me 15 minutes, but that's a horse, or pony, I should say, actually pollarding a holly. It's coming back every other year, and you're getting bollings and things. Was that one of the ways we got the idea to pollard? Don't know. And of course, we got to get the arborist in there. But a lot of people don't realise, that one's been obviously cut, but what a lot of people don't realise is that these bosses are old infestations of mistletoe. Did you know that? No, you see. Get Philip Wilson's book. Oops. Parakeets. No, yeah, that's parakeets, all right. Nasty little things. And, of course, the one I love best, after my days in pathology, plant pathology, that's the old hedge cutter. I love it. Just inoculating the hedge. Do you like it? Oh, dear. Sorry? And, of course, this is squirrels. People don't realise just how many animals actually live on things like catkins. They love the nectar from the catkins, and this is squirrels. They're actually going out on the branch. This is heavy. They're heavy, and nipping the twig off, taking it back, and then taking the catkins off. This is wood pigeons and squirrels on elm flowers. Incredible source of nutrients for these animals. All pruning. This one's on hornbeam seeds, again pulling the seed back to get it off. And at the moment in the park I saw a couple of beech trees which had the squirrels are up there opening the beech husks to get at the fruit. Mildew. I've been banging on, where's my old friend Neville? Me tell you, we've been banging on about this for 30 years, about the effects of the 2 mildews on oak, and it's still not raised up. Where's my pathologist friend? Where is she? That, to me, this is the single biggest issue for oak, of the 2 mildews. The effects they have on them, not necessarily every year, but year after year anyway, they come back, they defoliate the trees or stop the photosynthesis, and I seriously believe it's one of the big issues. And Neville would obviously add the soil, but the 2 together I think are really crippling our oaks, and that's all over Europe. We've just come back from Sweden and Denmark, across Germany, France. There's mildew again. Oh, one of the mildews, because there are actually 2. How am I doing? Good? Yeah. Okay, frost damage. Diseases. This is red band on Pinus nigra. And that's really having a bad time. Squirrels again. In this case, the squirrel had ring-barked the centre stem, and you're getting a pollard. Is it pruning? Wind. This is what was left of a big area in the 87 hurricane. The response just after the storm, and that's what we're left with, shredding. And of course man shreds as well, or did. This tree, every arborist should see. Every arborist should see this tree. I'm prepared to hold a meeting there. Come and see it. It's on Hungerford Common. It's a massive beech. It's had Miraculous at least twice in its lifetime that I know. It's also had the hurricane, and as you can see, it's left stub ends. And look where the stub ends are. And you buggers are still cutting back to the branch collar. Why aren't you changing your attitudes to the trees? Look, natural. All of them stub ends. Is it natural pruning? But everybody here should see that tree. Let's have a meeting here. Where is he? Oh, you're retiring, sorry. But we get hold of the other chap, John. This is snow pruning, if you like. Most of you aren't of my age, so you've never seen a snowstorm or an ice storm. The Americans have, and the Canadians. They'll tell you all about them, and this is what can happen. But again, stub ends. Where's your branch collar? Yeah. Stub ends again. But I want to talk a little bit about these exposed areas. Cleft fit. I mean, I don't know what happened to this fence. If anybody in the audience can tell me why it bent, I think the extension was too long. But we've known for millennia about cleft wood, how cleft wood lasts longer than cut wood. And years ago, I used the idea that when you use a chainsaw, you cut across there, and the chances are you'll get all the cells. Whereas if it breaks or is cleft, it clefts along the cells, and the cells remain intact. and I'll leave that to Emma here or Lynn Body to tell you what happens with the fungi. You're going to tell them later? Good. And this one, I really do like this. This is a flail, but look what it's done. It's behaved almost like they've been ripped out. Natural cleaving. You like it? And this is the one thing that we're all worried about. We're saying, oh, what does flailing do to hedges? I maintain it's the best way to do it. There you go. And what's interesting in this one, this has been flailed 2 or 3 times, and you can see the dieback on some of them. But you'll also see that when animals do it, you'll also see it when you do it, that occasionally you get dieback on some of them. Don't know why. Some of them don't, some of them do. Nice question. There's a nice flail for you, cleft. And this is natural flail, if you like. But there again, you see, it's showing you that well, you know what I'm saying anyway. And there again, another one. Am I all right for time? Yeah? Oh, this is natural breakage. Reg and me tried to do something, didn't we, Reg? Nobody would listen to us. Cleft. That's near that's where is he? He's not in the audience. I can't go there. This one what really is interesting for me, this is abscission, and Neville introduced me that years ago, but in this case, the abscission, part of it didn't thing, so you've got a natural rip out. And that was after a wind. Horse pruning. They've got 2 sets of teeth, so in theory, in most cases, they can bite across it, and then others they have to tear. Yeah. Say no more. I'm just going through them, but there's some dieback on that one, and I think this is the last slide. Yeah, it's broom anyway, but it was torn. So it's just trying to sort of do an overview of how I see pruning. And is it relevant? I don't know. I've no idea whether it's relevant. You're not religious, you can laugh. But I do like this. That's my saying. And it is. The tree world is absolutely full of assumptions. And there are people in here that have spent their lives with trees that will tell you how those assumptions actually influenced us. And now we're coming back and going down other roads because of the information coming out. I think that's what we've got to think about. Science does not stand still. And your profession and the science of trees, it's not going to stop. We've got a friend of mine, she's not speaking today, but she'll tell you about the DNA that she's come up with. You ought to, really. You ought to give her a talk. But, I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing to think think about it, how it's changed, yeah? And that's it. And he's a nice chimp, too. And that's it. Why did we let the French get there before us? Thank you.
Ted Green there, always entertaining, generally slightly worrying as well if you're organising a conference. You're never quite sure what he's going to say, but I think we got away with that one. Next up, far more reliable, Tony Kirkham from Kew Gardens, who's talking about different species response to pruning phenology.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith. I think I got off lightly there. Well, I'm going to talk about phenology and pruning times for tree species, and what I'm going to be talking about is what is perceived the best time for pruning certain species, and I'm going to give a few examples. There's not too much science in this talk. It's more about observations that I've made during my career at Kew and working with trees, and actually putting that into practice. So this is Kew today, 320 acres. It's an incredible site. It's got a fantastic heritage landscape, and an incredible legacy of botanic collections, tree collections, which I've been really privileged to be a custodian of and looking after all these years. It was formed in 1759 by Princess Augusta, and she wanted to have the best collection of trees in any other garden in Europe. So even then there was a bit of competition. I'm not saying we're competitive as tree growers, but I'm going to boast that we have about 400 Trophy champions at Kew, which is the second most number of mature trees, biggest trees in Britain than any other garden. The first one is Hilliers, and they grow more cultivars than we do. We mainly concentrate on natural species that we've collected in the wild, so we know exactly where they come from. We have a collection of about 14,000 trees, just over 2,000 different taxa, so that's different species, and as I say, mainly species, very few cultivars. And our shrub collections are just as important, 8,000 different accessions, it's a number of different plants or groups of plants under one number, and around 3,500 different species spread through the gardens, and it's laid out in family order. And the great thing about laying a collection out in family order is that you can monitor trees, you can look at tree species, and you can keep an eye on them, one species to another, of the same genus or the same family, without having to wander too much around the garden. So scientists love it because they don't have to do too much travelling, and they don't have to do too much hunting when they're looking for different species. And it's laid out in family order, but of course that poses problems, particularly for pests and diseases. So if one tree, say for example all the ash are together, if they're going to get Chalara or ash dieback, then inevitably they're all going to get that. So one of my jobs is to spread these around. I'm lucky because we have a good tree management system at Kew, which I developed in the 1990s, and then more recently I've refined it and developed it. We use TRAC, Tree Risk Assessment Qualification, as our risk assessment tool. And we call this system TRAMS, which is an acronym for Tree Risk Assessment Management System. And what I didn't want was a risk assessment system just devoted to risk assessments. We needed to get something a bit more out of it that we could use later on for scientific research, arboricultural research, and also monitoring collections, looking at pests and diseases. The great thing is that every arborist has a tablet, and as the trees are being inspected, mitigation work's being requested, that comes up on one of these screens, and you can see the colour-coded that gives priority to work that needs to go on. And if the surveyor's out and he finds a tree with a defect that needs attending to quickly, then one of these, it will come up and it'll jump to the top and come up in red, priority. What also it does is we can decide and we can record when the actual date that we want tree work doing. I'm lucky I have my own team. We're not under pressure from commercial arboriculture, so we can go out and target tree work when we need to do it, or when we believe we need to do it, or when we would like to do it. And it's linked to Google Maps, so we can go out and find these trees pretty easily. And we're all on these tablets, and we can see what's happening and what's being done. And there are constantly new species coming through. That's one of my jobs as curator, is to bring new species into the collections and diversify the collections and look potentially for trees that could be more resilient for the future, for climate change, or pests and diseases. And it's climate that I'm going to get onto. And just like Klaus Matek, this is Tilly, my Stupsy. She's my model, because my wife refuses to do it now. And she poses for photographs for me. And we have at least an hour or two every morning walking around the Arboretum looking at trees. And these are two relatively new species, new kids on the block. The one on the right, Aesculus wangii, one of the buckeyes or horse chestnuts from Vietnam. Wangii meaning king of the horse chestnuts because it's got the biggest conker. So inevitably my son is a champion conker player at school. And this is, I call this a really miffy tree. It's a real moody tree. And if you start pruning it at the wrong time, it turns its toes up and it just gives up. And I don't know why, but what I have done, because this is the fourth one that I've planted now, is I've worked out the best time to do formative pruning on it, because it's still a relatively young tree. And then we have Wollomai pine that was discovered in 1994 in just north west of Sydney, about 150 kilometres, thought to have been extinct 2 million years ago, suddenly reappears. And people say it won't grow in the UK, too dry, out of, away from the southern hemisphere, in the northern hemisphere, it's not going to do well. Actually, it's not a moody tree at all, and these are only about 10, 12 years old, and already they're starting to motor away. But as soon as you start pruning this tree, it stops. So it wants to be multi-stemmed. If you want it to grow, then you've got to let it do its own thing and let it become multi-stemmed. And the champion, the biggest of its kind in the gorge, has 40 stems. So, big tree. So what are the effects of pruning? We all know we have to prune, and we all know that when we prune trees, we do put some stress on them. So we reduce photosynthesis. We encourage epicormic growth from the trunk or the scaffolds. Potential energy reserves, carbohydrates are lost in cut branches, so the branches that we're cutting off, we're getting rid of carbohydrates that the tree will need. And valuable stored carbohydrates, we lose those that they would need to repair the pruning cuts that we're creating. And stress trees, we may weaken them, especially if we prune them at the wrong time by pruning and we make them more susceptible to microorganisms that invade trees through pruning wounds, etc. And then phenology. What is phenology? Well, this is a typical example. Phenology is a study of seasonal changes in plants and animals, a natural occurrence that happens from year to year, such as the flowering of plants, emergence of insects, migration of birds, mammals, etc. And especially timing the relationship with weather and climate. And certainly now, that's all changing, it's all moving, and things aren't as straightforward as they used to be. And biodiversity in trees, in woodlands, in gardens, is pretty mixed up at present. In Shigo's Modern Arboriculture, he says, he quotes phenology as the timing of natural processes, and that's a pretty simple definition of phenology. And at Kew, we have what we call the Q100. So we have 100 plants dotted through the gardens, and every year, so for the last, I think it's about 60, 70 years, we've recorded when they come into flower, or when they break bud, when they come into leaf, when they flower, when they fruit, and when they drop the leaves. And we can see changing patterns through the decades. We would normally look at the phenology as 4 seasons, so spring, summer, autumn, winter, and as I say, more recently, and certainly I've been at Q4 just over 40 years now, 41 years yesterday, and so feeling pretty old now. And I've noticed an incredible change in the seasons. I've noticed that we're going from 4 to 2 seasons. So autumn and winter sort of merge into one. We don't have that clear definition that we used to do. November, hard frost, total defoliation, all the trees are naked. Now it's moving on into December, and it's just a gradual change, and no real cold weather till January, February, if we're lucky. And then spring appears, and it's a bit of a surprise sometimes. Is it early? Is it late? And of course, BBC are always wanting to know, is it early this year or is it late? And then that merges gradually into summer, and before we know it, everything's in flower, in leaf, and we seem to miss the change from spring to summer. And things get mixed up, particularly the trees. I'm going to show you something that Alex Shigo did in 1991. I'm sure we've all got these books, great books, and they tell us a lot. But Dr. Alex Shigo certainly he talked a lot about phenology, and he said he did this circle, and he compared us as people, phenology in a day, so compared to a tree. So, you know, first of all, we wake up in the morning. Some of us a bit later than others. I'll not mention any names. We get dressed, we hope. We eat, we work, and then we go back to sleep. We go back and rest. And that's a typical cycle, a phenology cycle of us in a day. Shigo then looked at trees and compared it like for like. So number one, the tree wakes up in spring, onset of new growth. It forms leaves, it gets dressed. And then it eats, it feeds. And that's one of the most important parts of this circle, that high photosynthetic period. And then it goes to work. And it forms bark, wood, and stores energy. And then winter comes, and it goes back to sleep again. So I've shown you in a day what we do. That's in a year in the life cycle of a tree. And those numbers will move. If you had that as the 4 seasons, you know, winter, spring, summer, autumn, you know, that will almost be like a kaleidoscope and moving about on that circle, because we don't know when, you know, autumn, I predict that autumn will be early this year because of the drought that we've had, certainly in London. But then I always get that wrong, and we'll have a lot of rainfall next week and the week after, and autumn goes on to November, and the television get really pissed off with me because all the film crews come in to film autumn colour and there isn't any. So I've never got it right. So don't listen to anything that I'm going to tell you. Some of you will know the Ashkenazi potential energy curve that Shigo talks about in his book. And this really came home to me. I did the PTI course with Guy Watson, the Lantra PTI course. It's a great course. Guy, you owe me a drink. And I remember him showing me this curve and talking about it. And it took a while to sink in, but then it really came home to me how important this curve was. It was developed by a Russian fruit researcher many years ago, but Shigo picked up on it. And the energy levels of a tree are up here on the left-hand side, from low to high energy levels, and then the seasons along the bottom here, from January through to December. And I'll superimpose Shigo's the phenology circle. So number one, the tree wakes up. Maybe about March into April. Again, this curve is going to move. It's dynamic, but the tree starts to grow. Onset of growth. The buds break. It's producing new leaves. And then we get down to the bottom here, number two, and this is where the trees form in the new leaves. And you can see that the energy levels in the tree have really dropped down to low energy levels. And then as we climb back up that curve, the tree's feeding, high photosynthetic period, and it's starting to work hard and produce the sugars and starches and carbohydrates that it needs to function. And that's climbing up now, up through that 3. And then 4, it's starting to work. It's forming new bark, forming new wood, and it's starting to grow. And then as we go further along, we go into dormancy. So when a tree's dormant, it has high energy levels because it's stored all those carbohydrates that it's produced, that it knows that it needs. And as we heard earlier, trees are smart. Trees know what they have to do, and we need to trust them. And that's what they're doing here. But what you'll notice is that 3, as that graph starts to climb in that period, that line there is probably the best time to start pruning trees. I know that we have to prune trees at certain times because we're commercial. But if you have trees that you need to take a little bit more care and attention of, and trees that are stressed or young moody trees, then that's the time, one of the optimum times for pruning, when the tree has the potential to cope with that. So some of the trees that I'm just going to show you some examples of trees that do prefer summer pruning, and I'm going to come on to bleeding and sap leakage, etc. in a minute. But some of the trees that I've noticed, that if you prune them in the winter, the wrong time of the year, then they start to produce cankers and die back and never really perform. This is Corylus fargesii, and it's one of the hazels. It's one of the tree hazels. It's got flaky bark, and I think for me, that would determine to me that these flaky bark species would prefer summer pruning. And I've seen trees of Corylus that have been pruned in winter, in midwinter, and then they've just really struggled the following year and produced lots of dieback and cankers in the stems. Aesculus turbinator, and I've put turbinator in just as an example, but Aesculus, some of the Aesculus species, again, prefer summer pruning, and I've got better results doing formative pruning and structural pruning by doing that in the height of summer rather than waiting for the winter. And of course the snakebark maples. I've just put this one in Acer tegmentosum, the amber maple, but most of the snakebark maples, Acer davidii, rufinervae, tegmentosum, etc. They do. Pennsylvanicum is another one that prefer summer pruning. So after that line of 3. Now, of course, there's some trees that we know bleed, and there's a joke, isn't there, for arborists? I wanted to be an arborist, but I couldn't stand the sight of sap. And I think in the US we call it sap leakage. But this is when the pressures of sap are running up the stems, and we make a cut, and it's basically like turning the tap on, and the sap leaks out of the pruning wounds. And birch is a classic example. Certainly maples, and I'll list some species in a minute that are more prone to this. Of course, it's used commercially for maple syrup production, birch bark wine, etc. The Jubea palm for Jubea wine in Chile. So commercially we have cottoned onto that, and we realise that we can get that material by wounding the tree at I'll say the wrong time of the year as an arborist, but the right time of the year if you're collecting that sap. And then trees like Morris nigra, they'll leak a latex, a horrible rubbery thing. So not only are you going to get sap leakage of this latex dripping off, but when you get it on you, then it contaminates your clothes, your hands, etc. And in a public garden like Kew, we get claims for anything like that. If people get it on their clothes, then they're going to come back and they want either free entrance or new clothes. So we have to be a bit careful. And of course, if we cut things like Rus trichocarpa, Rus viniciflua, the lacquer tree, then we're creating a real hazard, because that is highly toxic sap that some of us will be very, very susceptible to, and will get blistering on us. So we have to wear the right PPE when we're pruning trees like that. Juglandaceae, for me, is the one that I always use at Kew when I'm doing demonstrations and I want to get a tree to bleed. If it's the right time of the year to get it to bleed, then I know that if I cut a walnut, I can get it bleeding within a couple of minutes. And it starts with a drip, just leakage, and then a drip, and then I've actually seen it where it's running out like a hose pipe. And it can be quite daunting if you're not used to seeing that. And just here on the left, this is a champion. Well, it's not the champion, but it's a county champion of Juglans nigra, a fantastic specimen planted in the 1760s. Imagine if you did pruning cuts all over this about March time, or even February, then you'd get wet walking under it. And there's nothing you can do. The old wives' tale is, rub soil on the cut and that'll stop it. Well, it doesn't. It just makes a mess. You have to live with it. And it will actually stop itself, and you have to be used to that. But all Juglandaceae, so Terra carrier, the wingnuts, carrier, the hickories, and I haven't put platycarrier up here, but platycarrier is another one in Juglandaceae that will bleed and leak sap. So here's just a few other trees. I'll not go through them all, but certainly Acer, Betula, Carpinus, Carrier, I mentioned Carrier and Juglands, Laburnum, Magnolia, the deciduous spring flowering types, Morris, we've talked about that, Poplars can bleed, and Sophora, I'm not sure about Stiphanolobium now, but certainly Sophora will do sap leakage. And vines, and actually what we do with vines in glasshouses as horticulturalists, we have the long rods, and to get sap to the end, because we prune all the laterals off to get a crop, we literally untie it and tip the end down lower than the root system, so we can really speed up the sap run down to the end, so we get a full living sap-filled rod. And I suppose the longer you do the rod, the longer you have to leave it down to fill that. So we've looked at leakage, sap leakage, and bleeding. I want to look at pests and diseases because we talk about rosaceae. It's probably one of the most questions I get. When is the best time to prune my cherry or my fruit trees? And laburnums, poplars are the same. The rhododendrons, they can all suffer from silverleaf. So silverleaf is Chondrosterium purpureum. Silverleaf is the symptom, but that's the fruiting body. So it's purple, but the silverleaf comes from the silver leaves that is a symptom of the disease. And cherries pretty susceptible to this. So the best time to prune these is when the spores of Chondrosterium are inactive. So that's around July, August. That would be the best time for pruning fruit trees or rosaceae, and particularly decorative rosaceae. We need to start thinking out of the box as well. So there are things that we don't have yet, but we've heard several times yesterday and today about pests and diseases that are on the horizon that are looking to come to us. And God, we don't want them, because when I was at Maris Wood in 1976, 77, the only thing we were looking at was Dutch elm disease. Nothing else mattered. There was nothing, and honey fungus. Now, that curve we saw yesterday is just shooting up, and as we heard, there are more pests and diseases today, this century, than the whole of the 20th century, and we're only less than 20 years into it. So, and we do know, because of the horizon scanning that we were doing, what is out there and what is waiting to come in. And one of them is the bronze birch borer. We don't have it. I'm sure Ed has lots of experience with bronze birch borer. So in the States, a lot of birches are grown multi-stemmed, so that if a stem's infested by a borer, then they can take one of the stems out, and we're not losing a tree, rather than it being on a single stem. But the bronze birch borer has a really good nose. It can smell the sap of birches, and it hones in on that smell. So, should bronze birch borer come into this country, then we need to be leaving pruning. We shouldn't be pruning between May and July, when the bronze birch borer is active and flying. And I think that one of the policies, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, but is to avoid excessive pruning, so you're not giving off that scent, and never to do more than 25% thinning on a birch. So that's thinking ahead, should we get bronze birch borer. And then oak wilt. I think we've had it, and it's been cleared, it's gone, but it's inevitable that we will get it. Sweet chestnut blight is we all thought we wouldn't get that, and that's raising its head every now and again. And And we hope that we don't get oak wilt. We've enough with oak processionary moth, we've enough with acute oak decline, with oak mildew, with grey squirrels, with parakeets. We do not want oak wilt. And it affects the red oaks. So Quercus rubra, palustris, coccinea, velutina, those are the ones that it targets. And there are strict regulations in many states in the US about pruning operations on red oaks, when you can and when you can't prune red oaks. And the best time to prune is between autumn and spring, never between spring and late summer. So that goes against the number 3 principle. So we're going to number 5, where the energy reserves are good. Because the insects are attracted to it, or insects are attracted to the sap that then become vectors and move oak wilt from one infected tree to a healthy tree. And dare I mention oak processionary moth? Sorry, Henry, you'll be itching. We've had so much experience of this at Kew now, and it's become a real problem for my arborists. It's pretty smart. It can read labels. So the one way that you could fool it is by changing the label and see if that dissuades them. But they only feed on European oaks, and I only know of one oak, Quercus alba, so a North American oak that it's been feeding on, and that's because it's in the Rover section. So it's very closely akin to the English oak. But you can see it there in procession, going along the branch, usually on the underside, so it's good for detecting. But you can see all this silk. This is what they weave their nests with. And after it has 6 instars, and after the 6th instar, the hairs on it become toxic, and it uses those hairs with the silks that it weaves to build nests that it lives in. And Henry and I were just talking at lunchtime, because every now and again, every 5 or 7 years, if it's not managed well, you get a population explosion. And I went to see Henry in the Netherlands, and he showed me population explosions. These are all nests, OPM nests, in a Quercus robur. and that is full of hairs with barbs that are toxic. So if you send your arborists up through there without PPE on, then you're in trouble. And even when the caterpillar's not active, but the nests are there and the hairs are there, they're around, they persist for about 5 years, and they just stay lodged there in the bark of the tree. Then they'll come off in your clothes, and then they'll do this. And that's gone through a polo shirt and caused that rash that he had for 6 weeks. Luckily, you can cover it, you can put cream on it, but if it gets on your neck or exposed parts of your body and the sun comes out, then it aggravates. So when is the best time to prune oaks now in an OPM zone? And Kew is right in the middle of an OPM zone, and of course it's spreading. It's moving pretty rapid now. It's out to the M25. We're pretty clean at Kew now because we have a program of spraying each year. So we do a prophylactic spray before we see it and before it becomes a problem. However, we do have small outbreaks up in the canopies of trees. So now our oaks, we wait till they're totally dormant. The caterpillars are around from April through to June, so you definitely would not be wanting to climb in oaks during that period. Then we would wait till it's dormant, and they'll wear PPE now when working in oak trees. So we need to look at those times. So summer pruning, we use that as well for restricting growth on trees, particularly fruit trees. So July into early August is when we're doing all our restrictive pruning. Things like spaliers, cordons, small bush trees, pyramids, etc. We're pruning back to prevent the tree from pruning vegetative growth and encouraging fruit growth. And we'll do that, as I say, in summer. And of course, let's not forget decorative vines like the wisteria. So July into early August, we're cutting those wispy, those long shoots back that it's produced that year, back to 5 buds, to stop it producing any more vegetative growth, and forcing the buds below that into making flower buds. And then we'll go back in February, and if we're brave, we'll prune those back to 3 buds, sometimes 2, to guarantee having good flower buds on the tree. And I put this in for Ted. I had to, we have to think about veteran trees, and I took this out of the Veteran Trees, a guide to good management. And you can see along the bottom here, this is out of the, showing the best time to work on veteran or ancient trees or stressed trees. The best time is, where are we? Yeah. So not good, April, May, June. Possible June, July, August. Not good again, September, October. But November, December, better. And actually, that should be three asterisks. So this is the best time. And I've not done work on veteran trees, Vicky. So I'm out to preserve trees rather than wrecking them. So yeah. and I hate sap streams. The other one is thinking about wildlife and the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981. Nesting birds have a right to nest in hedgerows, etc. So it's illegal to damage a bird's nest. So we have to get our timing right for hedge cutting, etc. Pleaching is another one where we get lots of birds nesting. So we have to think about the biodiversity that goes in a garden and respect it and look after that. And finally, because Ed showed his books, mine's in there as well. This one has, the latest book has a lot more about pruning times in the A to Z, with all the different genera and as many species as I could list based on my observations at Kew. Thank you.
And finally, for today's collection is Reg Harris, who's talking about new thinking about retrenchment pruning. Reg Harris from Urban Forestry, Bury St Edmunds. Over to Reg.
Thanks very much, Mick. So I just thought I'd start off, well, first of all, saying thank you very much to the Arboricultural Association for having me here and letting me speak about this. It's a subject that's really dear to my heart. But I thought I'd just start off just sort of giving you a little bit of background about myself and how I got into environmental arboriculture, some of the stuff I've been doing and some of the problems that I've seen, and then also the results of a big meeting that we had in January this year with a few key players in the industry about the subject. So I thought I'd start off with an embarrassing picture of myself. I've been an arborist since I was 18. I started work at a place called Ickworth Park in Suffolk, where I learnt to climb. Surprisingly, I've managed to survive, so the arborists in the audience will see that absolutely everything I'm doing here is wrong. I'm standing on the branch I'm cutting off, which is kind of a major no-no, and after that also there's major crimes of fashion against arb going on here, especially with that noddy helmet I've got on. But anyway, so I started work at a place called Ickworth Park in Suffolk, as I said. It had a profound effect on me because it's a brilliant site for ancient and veteran trees. As a young man, I was able to climb these trees, and I had this amazing sort of a feeling, a sense of connection with the past. I really felt connected to them. Beautiful things to look at, and amazing to be able to climb them, and that really had a big effect on me. After a couple of years, and I worked through the 87 hurricane there, so that was also interesting times. But after a couple of years of working there, I left to be a freelance climber, and then after that, a couple of years later, in the early 90s, I started my business. So in my business, we're very lucky that we still work for the National Trust, and we also work at Ickworth. In fact, some of my guys are actually working there today, which is a bit ironic. But I formed this connection with the National Trust, and after about 10 years of contracting, I kind of got to that point in my career where I'd sort of was wanting to know a bit more about things, and in particular old trees. And when I heard there was a course at Hatfield Forest called the Biology of Decay course, which was run by Jill Butler, David Lonsdale and Keith Alexander, where for the first time they put together all aspects of old trees, and it was how they grew, how they decayed, how they, all the things that lived on them, and it was a brilliant, brilliant course, and it kind of completely changed my outlook on trees. So, but it's whilst I was there, I met Vicky, and Vicky was the site manager at the time there, and Vicky said to me that she'd just had the site surveyed by Neville Fay and Treework Environmental Practice, and that they were looking to find some contractors to carry out some what was new and experimental work at the time. And so I kind of jumped at the chance of that. But what was kind of groundbreaking at the time, that Vicky had this idea that instead of asking us to pay to go on a course, she paid us to go on the course, and that was like, okay, I'll have a go at that, and that was great. So we went on the course, and what happened was that at the end of the course, if you sort of seemed to have the right aptitude, you'd get selected to then go on and do the work that came about from this tree survey. And we were very fortunate that got selected along with a few other companies, and it was kind of a collective of companies, which is interesting because it's a very sort of Swedish idea, even though Vicky wasn't married to a Swede then. So that was cool. But anyway, so fast forward 30 odd years, and now running this Arbor-approved contracting company in Bury St Edmunds, and we get to work at some of the great sites around the UK, including Hatfield Forest, Sherwood Forest, Aspel Close in Suffolk, Ickworth Park still, and others. I thought I'd just start off because my experience of this type of work is generally just with lapsed pollards, and I thought particularly if we've got sort of foreign guests here that people aren't aware exactly what a lapsed pollard is, and sorry if you do. But I just thought I'd start by just describing what I consider it as a lapsed pollard. So it's usually a tree that has a low, squat bole, nearly always hollow. They would have had their tops removed when they were very much younger, and really small trees, and they were, to coin a TED phrase, a working tree. So they would have been cut for things like fodder, for animals, for timber, for firewood, and all sorts of other things like that, and shipbuilding, things like that. And they would have been cut in cycles, so they would have been cut every sort of 6 to 25 years. And a lapsed pollard is a tree that hasn't been cut for a long time, and very often these crowns haven't been cut for 150 to 200 years, the type of trees that I've been working on. There are issues with that, in that as they get large, and you can see it dropped off there, they often large open canopies, often associated with decay, and you have these big crowns sitting on what are hollowing boles. And the problem was that, as over time, that sometimes these trees do fall apart. And at Hatfield Forest, they were starting to recognise this, and in the 1970s, they were concerned that their lapsed pollards were biomechanically failing, and that there was issues with, when these big branches came off, that they might tear down the trunks. It left the crowns open more to further wind throw, and also when these big branches tore down the trunks, they're often quite fragile, that they sometimes it led to the demise of the tree. Also, great loss of photosynthetic material at the same time. So the National Trust recognised this. I've just seen the recognised this in the 1970s, in the late 70s, and thought they'd try and do something about the trees failing. So they decided to start a repollarding program, and what they did is cut the tops off the trees in a wanna, and you can see the results of it. About 10% of the trees that were cut, first of all, many of the trees, as Luke was saying, they did start to grow initially, but after some time, they started to die, and ultimately 90% of the trees that were cut died. This tree, which is a really iconic tree at Hatfield, well-known tree, was one of the ones that was cut and did manage to survive, and perhaps that tells us something. You know, had really good vitality. So around this sort of time, the Ancient Tree Forum had formed, and people were starting to talk about old trees and the way they grew. And you know, when I used to look at an old tree that had a dead top, I thought it was dying. You know, I thought it was dying from the top down. And what we now know is that, you know, to coin a TED phrase, that the trees were growing down, and or retrenching. And you can see here, you know, where you get these dead branches coming down, and that what the ATF were first discussing in the early days is that what we're seeing was that lower down there was lots of, you know, stored up live growth, and it was this lower secondary canopy that was really, really important. It was kind of the tree's insurance policy for further and further growth. So you can see here, this is a tree at Netcastle Estate that Ted showed me, and it's the first tree that I've ever seen where you can see how the crown has died. You can see all the big dead branches, or retrenched, or grown down. But the secondary crown that was lower down has regrown. And in this case, it's the first one that I've ever seen of where the crown is actually starting to overtake the retrenchment. So what's interesting about this is that the crowns can come and go, and over many, many decades, and possibly longer. So at the time, just before the survey was done, Neville Fay was developing ideas about retrenchment, and he came up with the genius idea that could we mimic the retrenchment or the crown dying, you know, back in the periphery dying, because he was thinking about pruning these trees and trying to stop the biomechanical failure of the trees. And he came up with the idea of retrenchment pruning. And what was interesting about this is that the tree would be cut in stages over decades rather than 1 year. And each time it was cut, it would allow the crown to regrow and the roots to recover. And then in cycles of anything from 5 to 8 years, the crown would then be cut a bit lower again and a bit lower. So that ultimately you'd end up with a lower, what was then mechanically produced secondary crown. And this secondary crown could then go on to form another new crown, which then could perhaps be managed in cyclical form. So those of us that got selected on the course sort of jumped in with both feet and set about this work, and it's in about 2002 we started doing this, so we've been doing it a long time now. And we started making the first cuts, making these stage cuts, and it was a really exciting time because it was completely, to my mind, experimental. We'd seen Neville's guys come and give us a demonstration how to do it, and after that we were on our own. And it was a great time because we shared the work with all these other contractors. And you know, it was nice to work with other contractors, because often as contractors we jealously guard our work and we don't talk to one another. And suddenly here we were all working together, and it was a great way of sort of sharing ideas and an exciting time. So can you remember this picture? I'm going to show you a picture of this tree a bit later. If I can get it to go. So another feature of the type of work that we've been doing was using stub cutting. And you can see there, that's where a stub's been cut, and there's stubs all over this crown. And the idea that was, and that was in conjunction with some other cuts as well, but primarily stub cutting. And the idea of stub cutting that we thought at the time was that when you cut, you leave a stub, that rather than target pruning, you get an explosion of like frithy growth around that stub. Sometimes the stub would die back a little bit, but usually we're finding that we were getting growth coming anything from 10 to 30 centimetres down the stem. And the idea is that, you know, as we made each cut, that growth would force down the stems, and that when we came to make the last cuts, which would be anything from 2 to 3 metres above the bowling, we would have that lower crown, that lower secondary crown that I was talking about a minute ago. So here's an example of a lapsed hornbeam pollard at Hatfield. You can see all the usual features, bowling there, crown on it. And this has had its first cut, so it's just after it's cut. So very small cuts. You can hardly tell it's been done. Lots of photosynthetic material still in the crown. And then after a number of years, we started getting on to the second cuts. And here in the crown, you can see that the cuts on the top of the crown are starting to get much larger. You can see that the stub's there. And in the background on the left, you can also see an oak that's been cut, that's had its second cut, and you can see all the growth on the ends of the branches there. A few years later, 15 plus years later, with some of these trees, we're starting to get into the third cuts. Now, it's at this point, I was starting to get a few alarm bells ringing. I was getting a little bit worried about what we were doing. And you can see here that this is a hornbeam just about before its third cut. There it's been done. And that's due another cut, so that would have 4 cuts. And at the time, I was starting to think, we're actually removing a huge amount of vegetation here. You know, I was estimating anything from 40 to 60% of the crown volume. And I thought, we don't even do that in conventional arbs, so why on earth are we doing this to our really old, vulnerable trees? So another example here. Previous to the tree having its third cut, this is another hornbeam pollard, and you can see it here during. That's not a filter; it's bloody Baltic in East Anglia in the winter. But I was thinking about this. You can see where the cuts are being making, and that this crown would have been sort of coming down like this. But then it was going to need another cut a bit lower down here to meet the final objective. And that worried me because I was thinking about the size of the wounds we were making, and they were becoming larger and larger and larger over time. And I just thought that goes against the grain with me. So I call this the hedgehog tree, and it's because what I was observing about this tree, and I sort of hate this tree, is because the cuts that we were making is they were all shooting and rocketing up skywards. They weren't growing down at all. I was just seeing that growth going uphill, not downhill. And you can see it's all on the ends of the branches here. Nothing going on in here, nothing down here. And to be fair, you know, the idea was that it came down and that hopefully there was stuff down there, but it's just all on the ends. And I was starting to think, you know, Ted and others mentioned mildew. Oak is really susceptible to mildew, and where we are in East Anglia, we get a lot of it. And I was worried and seeing, you know, trees like this getting affected by mildew, particularly when you get this explosion of growth. So we've got a lot more photosynthetic material than being prone to the mildew. That was a concern. So it's about, I've been sort of banging on about this a bit amongst friends and colleagues for the last 5 years or so, and I've been talking to Ted about it, and Ted said to me, you need to come and see a mate of mine, and this is his friend. It's Professor Mick Crawley. He's an emeritus professor at Imperial College London. He's a professor of plant ecology and an expert in oak, and he's got a scarily varied collection of oaks around the campus, and it's also the campus where Ted worked for 35 years, Ted? Yeah, as a technician.
I went on holiday there.
And what Mick had said to Ted was, I think oak trees stop growing at 40 years, and Ted in height, open-grown oak trees, mind you. And Ted said this to me, and I thought, that sounds a bit odd. But he said, you want to come down and have a look? And I said, yeah, of course, I'll come and have a look. And so we went down to Sealwood, and this is Mick, and that's Ted, and he showed us these two trees. So that the tree here is a parent tree. It's an ancient oak. You can't see it very well here. It's just difficult to photograph because of all the other trees around it. But what Mick had done is, in the early 1970s, he planted an acorn of this tree. And he planted it, and he said it grew like stink for the first 40 years of its life. And then he said it's topped out. And he said it hasn't really grown in the last 10 years. In fact, it's almost identical height to its parent tree. And what he was saying is, he said, I think oak trees open-grown oak trees, when they get to a certain point in their life, and after perhaps 40 years, they're self-optimized. They've got to the height they need to get. That's the maximum height it needs to get to harvest as much sunlight as it needs. And then it's the lateral branches that start growing, so it starts growing wider. Now, I didn't really register anything about this when I first saw it with Ted, and I sort of went away, and then that night I slept on it, and I woke up the next morning, I got really excited, rang Ted up, woke him up, which is a little bit awkward, and I'm sorry about that, Ted, but I just wanted to talk to him about it because I thought about the implications of this in some of the pruning work that we've been doing. And also other things like, if we've got 1,000-year-old oak trees in the UK, and oak grows at maybe 10 centimetres a year, why aren't they 100 metres tall? And also, that made me also think about things like, if these trees, once they self-optimize after 40 years, and they start to grow laterally, they produce these huge, wide-spreading branches. And I thought a good example of that would be the major oak in Sherwood Forest, where if you see that, it's just got these enormous side limbs that then try and support these great limbs that then to try and harvest as much sunlight as possible. So it made me think, and it's kind of echoing some of the stuff that John's just said, is that when we're cutting in the retrenchment pruning, and we're getting all this growth on the ends, is all that growth, is all that doing, is it just trying to put that 40-year spurt on? The vitality of the tree is good. All it's doing is just going up, and I just thought it's never going to grow down. So it also made me think that should we actually, and a bit like what John said, thinking about the torsional twisting on these trees, should we, and also that the fact that they're predominantly growing sideways as they get older, is should we, if we need to do any pruning, should we actually be concentrating the pruning on the periphery and the sides of the canopy rather than the top at all? Do we need to even touch the top? Because it's done, it's growing. So a few other things that were bothering me is, again, kind of what John, I hadn't heard John speak about this stuff, but there's so many similarities in the way we're thinking. Is that, again, taking the top off that tree, leaving those stubs, do we actually remove the dynamism of the way the tree moves and actually stiffen the branches? So you're then loading the top of that branch with what is a pom-pom of growth on a stiffened stem that then sits on a decaying and hollowing trunk. I didn't think that was perhaps ideal. Also, I was worried about with all this growth on this thick thatch, that it wasn't allowing the light into this lower canopy. You can see here, it's just all on the edge, there's not much going on inside. And that was another concern. But in the same time, I then started thinking, as we made these bigger cuts, as we came down and down, were we actually, again, with stuff that John's saying, actually firing up the fungi that's latent in the tree by aerating it? So could we actually be increasing decay by pruning? And again, and perhaps lastly, I also thought that I'm not sure whether we can actually mimic a tree growing down, using these techniques, because the tree perhaps isn't in the actual life phase of retrenchment. Does the tree actually need to be in that life phase, and can we actually mimic it by cutting mechanically? Because when that vitality is good, all it wants to do is go up and put that 40-year growth spurt on. And also, we're starting to see them fail. So this is an example of a beech at Epping Forest, and it's one that's been pruned and failed. And we're starting to get a few notable examples also at Hatfield Forest. So I don't know if you can see, but this has had a first cut. There's some been some cuts up there. Following about 5 years afterwards, the top, that's the second cut. Again, you can see all the cuts up there. And this is on the exit route as you go out. It's probably the biggest tree in the forest. But last autumn, bosh, sadly that failed. And you can see my colleague Stuart here, how big a limb that was. And Paul Muir actually then did a pull test on that. So the remaining stem is still standing, which is great. But there are other little things that are going through my mind as well. And as we're getting to these second and third cuts, one of the key features of environmental arboriculture is all to do with the splits, the cracks, the hollows, the dead wood, the decaying wood, all that. It's so important, for saproxylics, all the stuff that we all know. But we're going to be cutting that off. If we were going to get down to that 2 to 3 meters above the bowling, this stuff was coming off. And I didn't want to do that, so I kind of fell out of love with it. At the same time, it's all the roosting and nesting species. It's all the other things that live in the tree. The beetles, the insects. And I've a couple of years ago turned 50, and for my 50th birthday, I went to go and see the coastal sequoias and the giant sequoias, and did a tour of trees in California. Holiday of an absolute lifetime. And then when I came back, I reread Wild Trees, which is the book about Steve Sillett, the climbing botanist. And he was saying stuff in that book that he said when he got up those trees, he said there was stuff up there that wasn't supposed to be up there. They were finding, all sorts of different things up those trees that weren't supposed to be up there. And that made me think about what we've been doing. It made me think, it's like, what's up those trees that we don't know about it? What's living in those trees that we don't know about that perhaps we're cutting off? And I don't mean any disrespect to ecologists, but primarily I think with old trees, the focus for the ecology of the trees has been the hollowing, and quite rightly so. It's the hollow trunk, and it's because ecologists don't tend to climb. And so the focus has been on that hollowing trunk. So I really think that we need to think about that, and I think in future we need to consider looking at what's in the upper crown of the tree and perhaps trapping it. And I've got a mate called Jamie Simpson, who's the tree and woodland guy and arborist at Knepp Estate, and he's actually done this, and he owns a wood and with a few ancient trees in it, and he started doing that, and he's exactly what Steve Sillett said. He's finding stuff up in the crowns of these trees that's not supposed to be there, and are we missing a trick? And I just think we need to think more about that in the future. So I mentioned that we had a meeting. Neville Fay and several members of his practice met at Hatfield Forest, including Vicky, who bravely chaired it. And we also had Luke Steer, who spoke yesterday, and also representatives from the National Trust. And we kind of had a look round and discussed what had been going on, and I expressed my fears and worries and things like that. And after also with a long conversation with Nev has said that what's actually happened, what we've been doing, is actually not what he intended retrenchment pruning to be. It's kind of morphed into, for various reasons, it's kind of morphed into something that he didn't originally intend. So retrenchment pruning, as we've been doing it at Hatfield, is off the menu. Neville did tell me that and if you read his book, Trees, A Lifespan Approach, he does talk about the cut should be no bigger than 50 mil. When I read that, I thought, that's not what we're doing, So he feels, and I'm not sure if I can completely understand it, but he's actually talking about sort of tip pruning the periphery of the canopy only, and in doing that, it's trying to stimulate his word vigor, and I think that's, and he'll tell you much better than I can. I'm not sure I completely understand that, and we have done tip pruning at Hatfield Forest, but I can also see that there might be a few problems with that, and again, if you tip prune the periphery of a crown, I think you're still going to get branches growing upwards. Still, particularly with the oak, it's going to be prone to mildew, and also it doesn't do anything about the torsional loading, about how we can perhaps, where we need to carry out some crown stabilisation. So in conjunction with Luke Steer, I'm very, very fortunate. I also work at Sherwood Forest, and Luke has a slightly different approach to the management of the trees there. Instead of surveying them and having a long period in between each survey, Luke goes and looks at them every 18 months. And so you look at them in the leaf, and you also look at them outer leaf. And I think that's that's an interesting and a good idea. And instead of trying to predict what's happening over, or trying to predict a 30-year program for the trees, it literally just highlights certain limbs that may require work. And we sometimes even go up there and we do the very technical wobble test, which we just wobble it just to see, and John's going to hate that. And so what we tried to do there is, instead of, when we do need to prune limbs, and this might just be one limb on the tree, and it's not overall crown reductions, so you target the pruning to certain parts. So we can actually, it's more crown stabilization rather than retrenchment. We've been using a technique called reduction via thinning, or older arborists know it as drop crotching. And I think it might be appropriate for this type of thing, because where you get these long limbs poking out of the canopy, you can pull them in, and it's like the idea is not to stimulate growth at all. It's not to, so we don't use stub cutting at all. You can see here, this is a tree that we did, and 2 years later you can see that crown has hardly changed. We have taken a few branches off, and what I think is potentially a good idea about that is that we're not getting the mildew, or branches that could be prone to mildew, and also we're not getting those pom-poms of growth on the ends. So I'm going to speak a bit quicker. Lastly, well, not lastly actually, I've been to Ashton Common recently, and I think other arborists are starting to think along the same lines. And you can see this tree. I thought it was a good photograph because it's the tree in the middle that in actual fact you can see kind of two styles of pruning on the same tree. And on here you can see the stub cutting, that pom-pom of growth, kind of like the lion's tail on the end of the growth. And then you can see up the top here, they've actually kind of reduction via thinning the top of the tree. So you've got foliage up the top rather than hard cuts. And I think in actual fact what may have happened is they've cut it and it's died, those stubs have died. But I just thought it was an interesting, so you could see one against the other. But also potentially by reduction via thinning, you can possibly open up areas of the crown to allow light in if that's what your objection is. So if you don't know what reduction via thinning is, it's really difficult to photograph. It's really so I thought I did a thing on the kitchen table just quickly to show you. So imagine that this is your long, extending, perhaps lateral limb. You cut that off. There's some lower limbs here that kind of look like they might elongate as well. Take those off, and that's the kind of the principle. And why I think it's good is that the cuts in there, it's not going to produce lots of growth. And also try and imagine that that limb could possibly be 2-3 meters long. And just apply that, and it could just be one limb on the tree. Anyway, so that's what we've been thinking about. So this is the tree that was asked you to remember earlier. It's had actually 2 cuts, and Jeff Monk from Treework Environmental actually resurveyed Hatfield a number of years ago now as well, and he started using the terminology "manage as a high canopy veteran," and I really like that. I think it's great, and so we have tried to do some reduction via thinning to the top of this tree, and you can see that it leaves more photosynthetic material on. We have in some places, as I said, it's not a perfect example, but you have reduced the loading on some of those branches, keeping the biodiversity in the crown of the tree. To my eye, it still looks like a beautiful veteran tree, and the aesthetic does bother me, and I do think that's important. So kind of in conclusion, I think it's a really exciting time, but I also think that our trees have never been under so much stress. Someone said to me once, I think that there's been more pests and diseases affecting our trees in this century than the whole of the last put together. These sites are where we go are becoming much more popular. There's a lot more people going to them. Where we are in the east, it's so dry that water is a problem. And it's also things like pollution in the air, pollution in the rain, and it's also things like increased nitrification, urbanization of these sites. Hatfield Forest, they've built literally hundreds, if not thousands, of houses around it. And what do at the weekend? They take their dog for a shit in Hatfield Forest. So, and we're guilty of that as well, because we all go and look at them as well. I'm completely guilty of that. So what I was hoping to say, and I'm going to be a hypocrite in a minute, is I think it's a really good time to continue the conversation. I think we all need to join forces, you know, the ecologists, the arborists, the consultants, and I just think we perhaps need to think more about this, perhaps have a bit more research into it, and hopefully we can leave these trees you know, resilient for the future. So, because I've nearly finished, I'd just like to say, whilst I've got this platform, I'd like to say thank you to Ted. Ted has been really, really good to me. He's given me a lot of his time and also encouraged me to speak where I'm not sort of naturally sort of confident in doing this, and he's encouraged me to speak and also thinks outside of the box. But more importantly, I have the pleasure of hearing Ted speak quite regularly, and pretty much 90% of the times I hear him speak, he stands up and he waves the flag for arborists. He said the working people, he always talks about how important arborists are, and I don't know anyone else who has the platform that he does that goes around the country and the world doing that for arborists. So on behalf of all the arborists, Ted, thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that little collection. They really are three of the best, those three, and brilliant presentations from all of them. Look after yourself, stay safe, and hopefully we'll be doing another one of these in the next couple of weeks. So take care of yourself. See you soon. Bye-bye.